Number 5 on this list is the Panama 7. The following story happened only a few years ago and is a horrifying tale where 7 people in Panama were found dead from a terrifying ritual. The BBC writes 10 people have been arrested on suspicion of murder. The suspects and all victims were thought to belong to the Nagobi indigenous community. The grave was discovered after 3 villagers escaped and made their way to a local hospital last weekend, prosecutor Rafael Baloy said. They then alerted authorities about several families being held by an indigenous-run sect. On Wednesday, police raided the community located in a jungle region in northwest Panama, some 250 kilometers from the capital Panama City. They were performing a ritual inside the structure. In that ritual, there were people being held against their will, being mistreated, said Mr. Balois. All of these rites were aimed at killing them if they didn't repent their sins. Inside the makeshift church, officers found a naked woman, machetes, knives, and a ritually sacrificed goat, Mr. Balois said. The site was controlled by a religious sect called the New Light of God, believed to have been operating in the region for about 3 months. According to Mr. Balois, the kidnapping and torture started last Saturday after one of the members claimed to have received a message from God. The victims were then kidnapped from their homes, beaten, and killed. So let me ask you guys, does that sound like something that God would tell you to do? Gather up a bunch of people, hold them against their will, and torture and kill them? To me, if any sort of entity was to tell you to do something like that, then that would be a demon or maybe the devil. Maybe that demonic entity would portray themselves as God or someone else, but I don't know what type of God would do something like this. To be completely honest, folks, I'm really not a religious person, so when I hear something like this, I believe that this was the work of people who were extremely sick or misguided. But I can guarantee to them, they probably really felt like they were acting as the vessel for some higher being. I think in this instance though, they really did misjudge who that higher being was. This happened literally back in 2020 as well, guys, so really not that long ago. My heart truly does go out to the people that were killed and to the families of those who were taken way too soon. Number 4 on this list is The Devil Made Me Do It. This famous Ed and Lorraine case may be the best example of when someone tried to claim a demonic possession led to a crime. The case is centered around a young man named Orrin Cheyenne Johnson and the man that he murdered, a 40-year-old named Alan Bono. Mental Floss says there was no question that Johnson killed Bono. However, his defense attorney, 33-year-old Martin Minella, planned to argue that the 19-year-old was not guilty by virtue of demonic possession. Ahead of the trial, Minella pled his case through the media, giving interviews to major press outlets. The courts have dealt with the existence of God, and now they'll be asked to deal with the existence of the demonic spirit, Minella told People. The day after Johnson was arrested, Lorraine Warren called the Brookfield police and blamed the killing on a demon. Johnson didn't actually say the devil made him do it, he only claimed that he didn't remember stabbing Bono. However, according to the testimony of an officer on the scene, Johnson did tell the police, "I think I hurt someone." Now, this defense didn't actually work out for Johnson. He was inevitably convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. However, he didn't serve nearly that many and was released after less than 5 years for being a really good prisoner. In my opinion, I kind of doubt that this guy was actually under the influence of a demonic possession, and clearly the jury, they felt the same way. That being said though, he did seem pretty committed to that story during the trial, so I suppose it's something to consider. Number 3 on this list is Manuel Vela. Several years ago, Manuel Vela killed his pregnant girlfriend. It was a brutal murder and an incident which climaxed in a police chase where he was finally captured. Many people obviously asked the question, why? And the answer may shock you. The Mystique says Vela told the interviewers that the murder of his girlfriend and her child were part of a religious and political statement. He was possibly trying to enlighten the crowd of his opinion on pro-life ideologies. However, it seemed like his motivation behind the murders wasn't just politically backed. He went on to say how he is the Antichrist and the voices in his head guided him on what to do. Many of his analogies were akin to things that have happened in the history of Christianity. Christianity. Vela literally believed that he was the Antichrist, guys. That sounds like a pretty textbook example of a demonic possession to me. At this point, Vela's competency to stand trial was in question and a hearing needed to be done. Manuel never actually made it to the hearing though, because in January 2017, authorities found him dead in his cell. He had taken his own life. Number 2 on this list is the Son of Sam. The Son of Sam was a killer that caused one of the biggest citywide police investigations ever. Ranker says New York City during the summer of 1976 was a hotbed of anger, frustration, and fear, and David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam, didn't help the matter by killing 6 people and wounding 7 others in the span of 1 year. After his arrest, Berkowitz told police that he was under the control of a demon named Harvey who inhabited his neighbor's dog and implored him to kill people. Once, during a 3-month break from his murder spree, Berkowitz wrote the New York Post to say, "I am still here like a spirit roaming the night, thirsty, hungry, seldom stopping to rest." After being incarcerated, Berkowitz received a sentence of 365 years in prison, by the way. He became a born-again Christian, but he still believes that the devil and God are fighting for possession of his soul. No wonder this guy got 365 years. Not only did he kill 6 people, but to write to the Times saying that he's still thirsty and hungry, yeah, this is clearly a man that needs to be kept behind bars for literally ever. Once again, I want to stress the fact here that I'm not a religious man personally. When I hear a story like this, I believe that it's far more likely that the Son of Sam was just truly mentally unstable and probably in need of some very serious help. He truly believed, though, that a demon had called upon him and was using his body as a vessel for evil. We may never know what truly caused him to do this, but at least he's locked up for good and won't be doing it again anytime soon. And finally, number 1 on this list is Michael Taylor. Several decades ago, Taylor was apparently possessed by a horrible demon, and this time it really got the better of him. Ranker says in 1974, Michael Taylor was just a simple butcher living in Ossett, England, who was suddenly overcome by an evil spirit. He had an exorcism performed on October 5th and 6th of 1974, and while it went okay, the priests weren't able to expel all of the demons. According to Bill Ellis, an authority on folklore and the occult in contemporary culture, in an all-night ceremony, the exorcists believed that they had invoked and cast out at least 40 demons, including those of incest, bestiality, blasphemy, and lewdness. At the end, exhausted, they allowed Taylor to go home, although they felt that at least 3 demons, insanity, murder, and violence, were still left in him. So, you know, kind of the big 3. After he returned home, Taylor immediately murdered his wife by ripping out her eyes and tongue and then tearing off most of the skin from her face, finally strangling their pet poodle. Police found Taylor standing in the street naked and covered in blood, shouting, "It is the blood of Satan." This is truly one of the most graphic crimes I've ever read about, honestly. Like, to think that this happened in real life is extremely scary. Also, if he was possessed by some type of demon, like, what demon was this and how do we all avoid this? I feel like this is pretty pertinent information considering what Taylor ended up doing.
Number 5, hit and run. A hit and run is probably in the top 5 lamest things that can happen to you. Simpsons hit and run, however, fantastic. Someone hits your car and then doesn't have the decency to pull over and check in on what's wrong. Even more frustrating is to know that you'll probably never get to find out who did it unless you have the army of the internet on your side. A Reddit user named Meatheaded had experienced a hit and run and, frustrated and at a loss, turned to Reddit to try and find some answers with what little evidence he had to offer. When he posted a picture of a broken headlight to r/what is this thing, he probably didn't expect as much of a response as he got, as it was kind of an odd question. But some 400 comments later, and Redditors had managed to accurately find the model of the car down to the make, model, and year, and all of this just off of a bit of broken plastic and glass. Meatheaded then took the information and ran it through a database and found a 91 gray Cadillac that had been reported stolen. Meatheaded sent the data over to the traffic crimes unit of his local police department, and were able to corroborate the data to track down the missing car and the suspect. Again, all just on a blurry photo of a broken headlight, which is downright incredible. Not only did they manage to find the car, but they also managed to connect it to a theft, busting 2 crimes with 1 post. Most Reddit posts don't get nearly that lucky. At most, you're getting a few upvotes, not solving a crime. And if you've got a love for scary videos, my friends, let us know. Subscribe to catch more of them every day, twice a day. Let's keep going. Number 4, phone scam. Now, not every crime has to be a grim one. Sometimes it's as simple as helping somebody get out of a scam. In 2019, an anonymous Redditor posted a complaint to the Reddit Bureau of Investigation subreddit, complaining that he had been scammed while trying to sell his phone privately. The Redditor had been in a bad situation, in dire straits, needed some quick cash, and was selling off an old phone to someone he'd met on a local listing site like Craigslist. He met the customer, who asked to meet late at night. Not thinking too much of it, the Redditor obliged, only to have his phone swiped quickly, and when he noticed the money he'd been given, he noticed that it was all counterfeit bills. Frustrated and scammed, he was helpless with no idea what to do. A Redditor reached out to the original poster and helped them track the number that he was given to contact the scammer. They searched through and found that it belonged to a 75-year-old man who didn't quite add up. So they did some more digging, and they found that the man who owned the phone number had one relative who happened to share a name with the scammer. Through more digging, the OP and Reddit discovered that the man had been arrested previously and had a suspended driver's license. Kind of amusingly, the original poster went back to the police with all this new information and discovered that the detectives had copied down the numbers of the scammer down completely wrong, so they were never going to be any help at all. 2 days later, they called him into the station to look at a lineup, and they'd found the phone scammer. His grandfather had been paying it off, and the relative he'd been looking into was the scammer's father. The detectives thanked him for his time, and they charged him with criminal fraud with the intent to deceive. The OP got it solved, he got the phone back, and the scammer got charged. And you got to hear about this story in this lovely video. So, win, win, win. Number 3, hit and run again. In August of 2018, a woman went out for a bike ride and tragically was struck fatally during a hit and run accident. There was nothing to tie a perpetrator to the scene, no cameras, no footage, no security footage. The only evidence that the police had found was a small black fragment of the vehicle that had struck the bicycle, but it looked indescribable. Not knowing what else to do, Washington State troopers tweeted out a picture of the fragment in a desperate attempt that maybe the internet's collective hive mind might be able to help them identify anything since, well, they were plumb out of ideas. The post eventually made its way to Reddit, posting to r/whatisthisthing, and we know from a couple minutes earlier in this video that r/whatisthisthing is really good at identifying random car parts left behind at the scenes of hit and runs. Well, lo and behold, the Reddit intelligence once again took care of the impossible, and within a while, the unlikely hero named Jess Nuts posted that it was part of a headlamp of an '88 Chevy Silverado. The Redditor clarified that he was a Maryland state inspector for years, and part of each of his inspection process was a mandatory headlamp adjustment. So he explained that he has seen a lot of headlamps in his time and immediately recognized what part of the car it should have belonged to. With this tip in hand, it was only a few days later, on August 14th, 2018, where the state troopers tweeted out that they were able to make an arrest after Reddit users identified the broken car part, leading them to the driver, who was swiftly apprehended. The driver had been driving very tired, allegedly, and didn't look back after he'd hit someone because he didn't want to see a body. Not really a great excuse. He was sentenced to 4 years. It may not provide all the closure for the family, but thanks to the help of some Reddit detectives, the case was able to be closed and some justice was able to be served. Number 2, Jane Doe. In 2014, Reddit user Call Me Ice shared a story about an unidentified set of bones lying in a cemetery in Strongsville, Ohio. The user was researching another cold case at the time, amusingly, and was searching for genealogy records and came across the unidentified skeleton and became very intrigued by the mystery. Why was there never an effort in over 40 years to make an identification as to who these bones belong to? Wishing to right a wrong, Call Me Ice posted to r/unresolved mysteries in the hopes of getting some resolved mysteries. The Strongsville Jane Doe, as she was known, was first found in 1975 by 3 boys who were exploring a nearby forest. They found a skeleton lying on a sandbar, mostly intact, but missing some of its jaw. Naturally, the bones were reported, and it was thought to belong to a woman estimated aged 18 to 25 who had suffered a fatal gunshot approximately 5 months before being discovered. Detectives at the time checked her across several missing women cases, but were unable to make any connections or draw up any significant evidence, and the trail went completely cold for decades. Until 2014, when Call Me Ice started to look into it. Call Me Ice got in touch with the cemetery and managed to get access to the original autopsy files and a photo of the skull. She sent it over to a digital reconstruction artist, who then made up a mock-up. Now, nothing too much happened for a while, until in 2016, the forensic artist who had done the reconstruction came across a listing on the NamUs website, that's the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, of a woman named Linda Pagano, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances around 1974. She'd come home from a concert and gotten into an argument with her stepfather and supposedly left to go visit her mother, where she was never seen again after. The forensic artist then contacted the medical examiner's office and pulled Linda's dental records, and wouldn't you know it, she matched the Strongsville Jane Doe to Linda Pagano. Although the identity of the attacker was never found, the family was able to find the smallest closure in finally knowing what happened to Linda Pagano, and it never would have happened without a Redditor bringing it back up. Number 1. The Grateful Doe. One of the more notable examples of Reddit solving a cold case was a 20-year mystery as to identify the body recovered from a car crash that was too damaged to be identified. In 1995, a Volkswagen van was found crashed into the trees off of a highway in Virginia. The driver was able to be identified, but his passenger unfortunately wasn't. A pair of Grateful Dead tickets in his pocket led to him being dubbed the Grateful Doe as a pseudonym. For 20 tragic years, the man was never identified, and the case was completely cold, with nary so much as a link. Until a Redditor caught wind of the case and was intrigued by it and opened it back up herself. The user then made a subreddit specifically for this case called r/Grateful Doe, and suddenly there was all this renewed interest from the greater collective of people working pro bono to try and find any connections they could. Digital reconstructions of the face, composite sketches, all this. Eventually, this caught the attention of someone who was sent an image of one of the composite sketches and said that it looked identical to his old roommate. After getting in contact with the roommate, he pointed the subreddit into the right direction, saying that the Grateful Doe's name, he thought, was Jason Callahan. Reddit then tracked down Shannon Callahan, Jason's half-sister, who upon seeing the composite sketch was moved and offered to take a DNA test. The DNA test confirmed everyone's hypothesis, and after 2 decades, an ice-cold case with absolutely no leads was able to be closed, and Jason's family finally got a little bit of relief to know what happened to their missing relative. The subreddit Grateful Doe is still active and now serves as a hub for several other cold missing cases, with others frequently being solved every day. Number 5. John Dillinger. John Dillinger is one of America's most prolific bank robbers. Hearing his name calls to mind fast-paced car chases, slick fedoras, revolvers, and banknotes. And for good reason. Dillinger managed to hit 24 banks in his lifetime. And I couldn't find any information on whether or not this is true. I'm pretty sure he holds the world record for most banks robbed. I have a strong feeling that he does. He was imprisoned multiple times over his crime career, but you couldn't keep a good career criminal like this down because he escaped prison multiple times. Now, the first time, Dillinger's gang disguised themselves as police officers, but his most famous escape was during 1934. After robbing the East Chicago First National Bank, Dillinger fired at a police officer, sealing his fate and landing him with some pretty serious charges, as up until then he was only charged with robberies. After the heist, a fire broke out at a hotel the gang was laying low at, leading to a tip that led authorities to Dillinger, who shipped him away to Crown Point, Indiana, and treated him as one of their most dangerous prisoners. All of them expecting him to try and escape again. And they were right to think that, because he did. Dillinger was surrounded by 6 guards at all times, armed and ready. But despite this, and the little free time he had, Dillinger was still able to carve a fake pistol out of an old piece of washboard using razor blades. Dillinger used his homemade wooden pistol to threaten the guards at, well, not quite gunpoint, but wood point, I guess, and forced them to free him and lead him out of jail. Dillinger jacked a car from a nearby alleyway, and with hostages under his wing, Dillinger had escaped again. This would lead to Edgar Hoover tightening up an FBI task force just to hunt down John Dillinger, placing a $10,000 bounty on his head. This led to an accomplice of Dillinger ratting him out, leading to his fatal final encounter with the police in an alleyway outside a Chicago movie theater, ending the legendary gangster's crime spree. Want to hear more about weird crimes? Subscribe to Top 5 Scary for way more every day. Let's keep going. Number 4, the Texas 7. The Texas 7 refers to a gang of 7 highly dangerous inmates who ganged together in 2000 to hatch an escape plan from John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security state prison in South Texas. The group comprised all kinds of nasty criminals, some on death row. Some of them were even serving 99-year sentences. All of them were serving long sentences with no chance of parole, and as such, they looked for other options to regain their freedom. Now what they had was strength in numbers. On December 13, 2000, the group launched their plan into action. They'd waited for the slowest part of the day when guard patrols were at their most thin, and plain and simple, started knocking officers out. They would have one member of the 7 beckon an officer over and another restraining and knocking him unconscious from behind. From here, they kept taking pages out of Agent 47's notebook and hid the officers' bodies, tied them up, and placed in a locked door, and stole their uniforms, credit cards, and ID from the victims. They then posed as police to ward off suspicion. From here, 3 of the men made their way to the back of the prison, changed into civilian disguises, and posed as a surveillance camera crew to install new monitors. They knocked out another guard and raided the guard tower and stole numerous weapons to take with them. The 4 who'd stayed behind stole a prison maintenance truck, picked up their co-conspirators, and fled the scene. Their newfound freedom barely lasted though, as the men had left a trail of evidence and were on the FBI's most wanted. Not helping matters was that mere days after the escape, they robbed a store, which eventually led to the death of an officer, leading to a $500,000 bounty for the capture of the Texas 7. A year later, after several tips, the FBI apprehended what members were still living who had scattered across the country. Those they found are back in prisons, unlikely to ever pull something like that off again. Number 3, El Chapo. El Chapo, otherwise known as Joaquin Guzman, is one of the most notorious drug lords to ever live. He founded the Sinaloa cartel in the 80s and dominated the trade. Over his long career, he was captured and arrested several times, but made a prolific habit of his escapes. His first arrest was in 1993, and it didn't stop him from running operations at all out of the minimum security prison, but it wouldn't always be this easy. In 2001, the cartel bribed the guards, who loaded Guzman into a laundry cart and simply wheeled him out of the prison like it was nothing. The next 14 years would see Guzman continuing out operations as normal, undeterred by his short time in the clink. He was incarcerated again in 2014, and this time the escape was a lot more elaborate, and he had a lot more help. In Altiplano Federal Prison, Guzman disappeared entirely in July, and authorities were stunned to discover that the cartel had been digging a tunnel for months that led directly from a small 2-foot hole in the showers. The tunnel spanned nearly a mile and was fitted with lights, ventilation, and most amazingly, had a motorcycle all ready to go for Guzman to ride to freedom, all the way to a cinder block house that had been constructed at the end of it. He would manage to elude capture again, for a bit at least, until 2016, where he would face extradition. He's currently incarcerated again, and knowing his reputation, who knows if he'll stay there. Number 2, Richard Lee McNair. Richard Lee McNair's story is perhaps one of the most wild prison break stories I had ever read. It's probably the most wild one on this list, to be honest. McNair was raised by a police officer, but would find himself straying from the law when in 1987, he robbed a grain storage facility in North Dakota, where he fatally shot at a man and wounded another. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, and a burglary charge on top of that. Unhappy with his new surroundings, McNair would sneak through a ventilation pipe in North Dakota State Pen in 1993, although he was swiftly recaptured. Now, one escape from prison is already pretty cool, but it was his second escaped attempt that was infinitely more impressive. McNair was eventually transferred to a federal prison in Pollock, Louisiana. McNair was assigned to the work detail in the manufacturing room, where he would repair broken items, including patching up old mail bags, which inspired him to hatch an ingenious plan. In secret, McNair built himself what he called his escape pod, a small compartment with a breathing tube he would hide inside. Now, he hid himself inside the mailbag pile, shrink wrapped and forklifted to a nearby warehouse outside of the prison. He mailed himself out of jail. He says the heat was unimaginable, that it felt like being inside a furnace, and that he was afraid he was going to pass out. When the warehouse staff broke for lunch, McNair cut himself free and fled the prison as fast as he could. He was apprehended by a local police officer, but managed to convince the cop that he was just a local jogger and not that escaped convict everybody's looking for. McNair fled to Canada, living across British Columbia, Ontario, and eventually settling in New Brunswick. Having successfully escaped the long arm of the law and living on the lam, fighting the law and winning. Take that, The Clash. Well, for about a year, at least. Despite managing his impressive escape, he was widely known, featuring on America's Most Wanted, and had to live a pretty quiet lifestyle. He was reported cited in Canada multiple times. Eventually, he would end up being busted for driving a stolen white van in 2007, describing his capture as just being bad luck. Just one of those days, MCNAIR said. After a year on the lam, MCNAIR was returned to the States, where he is now interred in a supermax prison deemed for prisoners where maximum security isn't enough. But I'm sure he's plotting a way to get out of this one. And finally, number 1, Alcatraz. Alcatraz was built to wear down the hopes of the most rebellious prisoners. The infamous San Fran Island was known as the Rock for how heavily guarded and seemingly inescapable it was. Of course, if you know about the movie Escape from Alcatraz, then you already know in 1962, 3 daredevil convicts did the impossible and managed to escape the unescapable. Between 1934 and 1962, there were 13 failed escape attempts. But I guess if anything, that just served as inspiration for inmates Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, who would prove everyone wrong. They had planned this for months. Frank Morris brought in his accomplices John and Clarence and their 4th accomplice, Alan West, who had all met each other from previous incarcerations and had a pretty good thing going. During the days, they stole spoons and discarded saw blades from the workyard and spent upwards of 7 months widening the ventilation ducts in each of their cells, with Frank Morris loudly playing the accordion to conceal their handiwork. That's hilarious, by the way. Whenever they weren't working on it, they covered the holes with gray painted cardboard. The ducts would lead to a tunnel where the 4 men had stored a 6 by 14 foot raft that the men had made out of discarded raincoats, held together with soap and sealed with heat from the steam pipes. These guys were unbelievably crafty, because check this out too. They assembled dummy heads out of paper mache, hair from the barbers, and painted them as realistically as they possibly could. They stuffed laundry and discarded rags under their blankets with their paper heads poking out while they escaped so it looked like they were sleeping. That is hilarious. That's like Ferris Bueller stuff. Unfortunately, on the night of the escape, Alan West was left behind when he couldn't get the grill of his duct off. The other men, however, weren't willing to wait around, grabbed the raft, slid down to the roof, and snuck to the shore. Now what happened next is lost to time. The prevailing theory is that the men drowned in the harsh waters on the way out, although the Anglin family claims that the men had escaped. Regardless of the truth, the men did the impossible.
Number 5, The Reverse Grinch. Our first story takes us to the town of Vandalia, Ohio in 2011. Tamara Henderson had been invited to a Christmas party at her neighbor's house a few doors down. She had been working hard lately and hadn't even had time to put up her holiday decorations yet, and decided she needed a night of fun. She planned to only stay a couple of hours and decided that she didn't need to reach out and find a babysitter for her 11-year-old son. She put him to bed, presumably to dream about sugar plums, locked up the house, and went to make merry with the other adults of the neighborhood. Little did she know, an unnerving crime was about to take place in her home. Her 11-year-old was woken up by the sound of someone breaking into the house and went to investigate. It was not Santa Claus, but what appeared to be a burglar. But strangely enough, this intruder did not seem to be interested in taking any of the valuables in the home. Bizarrely, he seemed more interested in decorating the home. He put up some lights, hung a wreath on the garage door, and then lit some festive candles before turning on a Christmas movie and kicking back to relax. The boy was both terrified and confused at the intruder's bizarre behavior, and phoned his mother at the party to get her to return. She called the police, but before they arrived, the intruder spotted the child. Thankfully, he was not in a violent mood, and instead simply said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you, I'll get my things and go." He was arrested and charged with burglary. It turned out that the 44-year-old man had been using illicit substances and had gotten into a festive mood and broke into the house to decorate and relax. Certainly unnerving, and though it could have been a lot worse, I imagine it was a long time before Henderson left her son home alone. Number 4. The Mystery of the Sodder Family Christmas. Next up in our journey through the disturbing is a tale from Fayetteville, West Virginia, where George and Jenny Sodder lived with their 10 children. The year was 1945, and George had found himself in some hot water with the local Italian community after criticizing Mussolini. An insurance salesman visited the home and warned George that his home would likely go up in smoke. The family figured these were empty threats and continued on with their lives as normal. Normal would soon become a distant memory once Christmas Day came around. In the early hours of December 25th, the Sodders were all in bed. Not a creature was stirring until the smell of smoke woke the family up. Realizing that their house was on fire, the family evacuated. As they watched the home burn, they realized that 5 of them were unaccounted for and feared for the worst. George tried to get back into the home, but found that his ladder was missing and that both of the family's vehicles were unable to start. What seemed like a tragic but simple crime became an enduring mystery when the smoke cleared and the investigators assigned to the case realized that there were no remains in the house. As the investigation continued, some people claimed that they saw the missing family members in a passing car, watching the home burn. The owner of a truck stop 50 miles away also reported having seen the missing Sodders in the company of some adults who were speaking Italian the day after the fire. The remaining Sodders put up a memorial begging for information on the crime, but no headway was ever made in finding out who started the fire or what became of the missing family members. Number 3. Lock your home for Christmas. Despite being a holiday best enjoyed with your family, resentments can often simmer until they boil over and cause a lethal incident. While there are unfortunately plenty of examples of family Christmases that end in bloodshed, I have narrowed it down to just one example from Covina, California, where one disturbed man's rampage and choice of disguise ensured he got his just desserts. In 2008, Bruce Pardo was going through a bitter divorce from his wife, Sylvia. In July, he began putting together a plan to get revenge for the perceived slights against him, and he began stockpiling weapons and constructing a device of his own. This device was designed to spray fuel so that Pardo would be able to ignite the scene of his planned crime. In September, he placed an order online for a Santa Claus costume. By December, the divorce was finalized, and by Christmas Eve, Pardo was ready to put his gruesome plan into action. He rented 2 cars and booby-trapped them, leaving one outside his brother's home and the other outside the home of his ex-wife's attorney. He put on his Santa suit and set off for his ex's parents' home, where he knew the entire clan was gathered for holiday celebrations. He rang the doorbell, and when the door opened, he immediately began his rampage. Of the 11 gathered family members, only one was able to escape the brutality and call 911 and identify Pardo. Once he was finished, he began spraying his fuel device to burn down the home, but the device ignited unexpectedly, and he was set ablaze. He survived, but the fire had fused the Santa Claus costume to his body, making him incapable of taking it off. He then made his way to his brother's home, where he took his own life. Number 2. The office party gone wrong. When invited to an office Christmas party, you could be forgiven for expecting a mundane affair where you are forced to pretend to enjoy the company of people you have nothing in common with, other than the need for a paycheck. But every once in a while, these parties can go truly off the rails, leaving everyone with a hangover in the beds of their coworkers, or in extreme cases, with a body count. Such is the case in our next tale, which took place on Christmas Eve, 1988, in the city of Los Angeles, California. A group of employees and their spouses were gathered together to celebrate a record-breaking year of profits when armed men took over the festivities. They held the office workers hostage, demanding to be led to the building's safe so that they could abscond with the bearer bonds within. The armed men were being led by a charming, well-dressed European man who led away the workers' boss for a chat. When the boss was unwilling to share the combination, only the intruder returned to the party. The men were professional and well-organized, managing to fend off an entire LAPD SWAT team that had assembled outside the building. When the FBI showed up and cut the power to the building, they didn't realize that they were playing right into the criminals' hands, as the cut power made them able to open the safe and begin removing the valuables within it. Perhaps most terrifying was their plan of escape, which involved leading the hostages to the roof, which they planned to blow up in order to be presumed dead, leaving them to get away scot-free. Fortunately, the husband of one of the hostages was an off-duty police officer who managed to sneak away from the party and take out the criminals one by one. Due to the actions of this one man, the criminals were defeated and most of the hostages managed to survive. The people working at the Nakatomi Plaza were fortunate that this police officer happened to be there. The odds against him were staggering, but he managed to survive, and in an odd twist of fate, would find himself in similar situations 4 additional times, although the quality of those stories would fluctuate wildly. Number 1. What happened in Kingston Falls? It is not unusual for crimes to occur on Christmas. As much as I hate to say it, every year we hear more and more tales about homes being broken into, people going missing, or even people being attacked by loved ones. But these stories usually do not define the season, and are rare on a pure percentage level compared to all the people who have a relatively normal holiday season. Every once in a while, you hear about crimes that happen during the supposed most wonderful time of the year that affect entire towns. As is the case in our final entry of this list of festive felonies. On Christmas 1984, the town of Kingston Falls fell victim to a bizarre crime wave that left much of the town in ruins, and several of its inhabitants in the morgue. Things seemed normal enough at first until a dog was found tied up with Christmas lights and dangling on a porch. The first real victim of this strange spree was the local elementary school teacher, Roy Hansen, who was found in his classroom. The room showed signs of an intense struggle, and the teacher's hand had been mutilated, and oddly, a needle was found stabbed into his thigh. Another man, Anderson by name, was found outside of City Hall with a missing arm. He had apparently been trying to mail a letter when someone attacked him. A local senior citizen named Ruby Deagle was found outside her home. Her chairlift, which she used to compensate for the lack of mobility she was experiencing in her old age, had been sabotaged and rigged to launch her out the window of her home, having been brutally attacked and seemingly bitten all over. The local law enforcement officers, Sheriff Frank and Deputy Brent, were sent to investigate the strange string of attacks, but were in a fatal car crash with an oncoming vehicle. When the vehicles were inspected later, it was discovered that the police cruiser's brake lines had been cut in an intentional act of sabotage. At the same time that this was happening, a local radio DJ, Rockin' Ricky, and his staff were also attacked. As if all this carnage wasn't enough, a local bar was left in ruins, a department store was completely demolished, and the local movie theater was blown up. Who was responsible for this heinous string of crimes? No one was ever caught or charged, and the only thing even close to a clue was a police report made by a local boy claiming that a series of creatures known as the Mogwai were attacking the town. Of course, such ludicrous claims were written off by the police, but no suspects were ever found. But with no criminals in custody, how long until a new batch of these crimes is unleashed upon an unsuspecting world?